Hello friends, last time we talked about how the ancient population of Japan successfully existed under Stone Age conditions for tens of thousands of years, and how all of a sudden things took a completely different path. Today we will talk about this in more detail. So, the culture that will replace the Jomon, the Ainu culture, it is called the period or the Yayoi culture. The new population, which is already the very ancestors of modern Japanese, will begin to settle the territory of Japan very quickly and very actively. The view that links mass migration to two factors, natural and social, is now the most widespread. The onset of climate cooling set in motion the population of Northern Asia, which began to move southward. This in turn caused political instability in China and later in the Korean peninsula. As a result, up to the beginning of the 4th century AD, a series of wars and turmoil continued there, leading to population flight. After analyzing many different data, the famous researcher of early Japan, Hanahara Kazuo, came to the surprising conclusion that the number of immigrants since the beginning of the Yayoi period was about 1.2 million, with a total population of about 6 million at the end of the 8th century. Although this figure is highly questionable by many specialists, most scholars still agree that the number of immigrants was in any case sufficient to cause dramatic changes in economic patterns, language, and culture in general. And people do indeed flood into the territory of Japan in huge streams. There they meet the Ainu, who live by fishing and hunting. And you would think that conflicts should have erupted between the new population and the old, but the surprising thing is, at first this didn't happen at all, because the two populations simply had nothing to share. The settlers would be interested in fertile areas where rice could be sown, while the Ainu were interested in places for hunting and gathering. That is, there would be virtually no overlap of interest between the two cultures. The only thing that will be of interest to both is fishing, which will lead to conflicts between the Ainu and the aliens. Nevertheless, there were no serious problems or conflicts at first, but they would begin very soon. In the history of Japan up to the 19th century, there would be many situations to push the Ainu north, to subdue and conquer. What did the Yayoi people expect when they came to the territory of the Japanese islands? Their expectations were probably high to start making weapons and modern tools from iron and copper. But it turns out that there is almost nothing in Japan. The iron is of poor quality and in short supply, the same with copper and other minerals available to mankind at that time. Expectations collided with reality, and this would also affect all future Japanese history, wiggle around and exist under such conditions. People who came from the continent, from the territory of China and Korea, they know that China at that time was the most powerful and modern civilization of that era. Yes, going through bad times at the moment, but nevertheless, a country with an enormous history and most importantly, practically the most technologically advanced in the entire world. And people bring from China the technology of flooded rice farming. Have you ever wondered why it is in Asia that so many people live? How did this happen and what led to it? A big part of it was rice and how it was grown. Take Europe, for example, for which the main crop is grain. Grain yields one crop a year. Once a year you have harvested some, managed to eat some, and good if you were able to send some away for storage, and good luck if there is any left over to sell. Ancient society depended directly on how much food the land could give them, and the number of people depended directly on that. More people need more grain, and in the case of poor harvests or other cataclysms, starvation follows, and then population growth is out of the question. In Asia, however, it is different and it is all about rice. If you handle rice properly, you can harvest it up to 4 times a year. And the Chinese, of course, already knew all this, and so did the people who came to Japan. You may have seen pictures of these huge rice fields flooded with water. It really is a beautiful sight. This is what is called flood rice farming. Imagine the perfect situation. You harvest the first crop, it's used for food. You harvest the second one, you send it for storage for a rainy day. You harvest the third one, you can try to sell or barter. And the fourth crop is on its way. This amount of food allows the population to grow very rapidly, which is exactly what is happening in Japan. People arrive from the mainland, they are born, and they spread out into new territories. You can see a reconstruction of a settlement from that period. What is so interesting here? These villages could contain up to 1,000 people. Of course, nowadays it sounds laughable, but if you compare it with the people of the previous era, the era of Jomon, they gathered in small groups of 20 to 50 people maximum, and it is already more than 20 times. Such settlements begin to occur everywhere in Japan, and at this stage it leads to a confrontation between the Ainu and new people, which leads to a gradual displacement of the Ainu to the north of Honshu Island and to Hokkaido. China will be like an older brother and role model for Japan for a long time to come, because China is indeed the most developed and the most important country of the region in many respects at that time. China calls itself the Celestial Empire. That is, from the very beginning of history, the Chinese believe that they are the center of the entire universe, the most developed, the most magnificent empire on Earth, and it is surrounded by some incomprehensible barbarians, completely uncivilized people. And it is from the written sources of China that we know about the early periods of Japanese history. They tell how the Ainu lived, how the settlers lived. Of course, they describe it quite specifically that there are some island people, they do something, but we great Chinese are not interested in that at all. But nevertheless, this is very important information about Japanese history. Much later, Japan will get its own written language, and it will be possible to learn about its history from Japanese sources. And of course, Japan wants to be like China, but at this stage only details are borrowed. And so gradually the Yayoi culture lives and develops. It lasted from about the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century AD, then everything slowly begins to change again. About the 3rd century to about the 6th century, the so-called Kofun period begins. What is it like? If you take, for example, the Jomon and Ainu culture, these people had absolutely no property and social inequality. What they caught and harvested, if there was enough for all, that's good, everyone had the same. In the early periods of Yayoi culture, society was also fairly equal, but where farming was successful, there was a surplus of food, and then people who could distribute it and interact with people in a different way started to appear. This is where property inequalities would gradually emerge, and so in the Kofun period all this becomes visible and the first Japanese proto-states start to form. This stratification is evident in the appearance of burial mounds. You might think, well, what's so special about them? But the fact is that it is the appearance of the barrows that begins to talk about the beginnings of Japanese statehood. Because if you think about it, if there is some person who is buried in such a burial mound, it obviously means that he is very important, whether he is a leader, a warlord, a priest, or someone who has enough power to say, when I die, you will build a huge mound on my grave so that everyone will know about me. Burial culture is very ancient and inherent in all people throughout history. Remember the Egyptian pyramids. Imagine how much power the Egyptian pharaohs had, that instead of building and developing new cities, developing new lands, they could just force people to build such structures, huge pyramids tens of meters high. Roughly the same thing appears in Japan when important people are buried solemnly in huge barrows. But again, it is easy to underestimate them. They buried them and okay. But look how huge the burial mound in this image is, even from a bird's eye view. This particular mound is in a modern city surrounded by houses, roads, trees. This speaks very clearly of the emergence of social inequality, which is not going anywhere. And the early Japanese state was quite powerful by the standards of the time because it was able to centralize the efforts of its population in this way. For several centuries or so in this era, people would live like this and continue to evolve. And then comes the Yamato era, around the time of the 6th or 7th century. The Yamato era is interesting because for the first time a real Japanese state was created, which would be called the Yamato state. It would be located in the southern part of the island of Honshu on the islands of Shikoku and Kyushu. Let's talk about some very important things that are beginning to happen first. The religion of Shintoism is beginning to emerge and take shape. From the leader's point of view, however, to strengthen and form a unified state, it is not enough to unite everyone around you with brute military force. You need people to want to follow you, preferably themselves. It is at this time that Buddhism begins to infiltrate Japan, a religion that already has strong foundations and a history that interests people. Buddhism will be addressed mainly by the elites, and not by all. Some will be for it, some will be against it. But nevertheless, Buddhism has already arrived, and it is already developing. And this adds legitimacy to the leaders, that it rules for a reason, because it pushes the wheel of the universe. We need it to keep this balance and to continue going and to develop. Later on, Shintoism comes into play as well, but we'll talk about that another time. The Yamato state develops, but over time it begins to feel as if something is missing. And if something is missing, the best way to solve such problems in those days is to look up to China. And from this time on, everything in Japan begins to change once again, and the Japanese state enters a new stage of its development. What exactly did they borrow from China, and did it work? We'll talk about that in the next series.